Hello and welcome to the Dave Isaac Podcast. I'm an artist, creator, human, and your host, Dave Isaac. Joining me today for our ongoing series where we unravel the mystery behind an artist team is the amazing Alison Rosenfeld. Alison has been a music supervisor for renowned company Aperture Music, where she has supervised placements for some of my favorite shows, like Fresh Off the Boat, Girls, and Community, to name a few, as well as blockbuster movies including Green Book, Game Night, Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, and Trainwreck. Alison has also had a long history of hosting her own radio shows, including Hissing and Scratching with DJ Bearcat, a weekly 2-hour radio show specializing in underground music, host of The Chill Zone. I know you spend a lot of time in the trenches searching for music and finding different ways to bring attention and using your platform. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You made me sound very accomplished.
Well, you are. I know this is kind of a little bit different than our normal session as a music supervisor isn't exactly going to be on an artist's team. But I did want to ask kind of how important is a publisher in this role? Like what percentage of music that you place would you say is through a publisher versus independent? And then maybe what are some tips for independent artists that want to make your job as easy as possible?
So, in regard to how important a publisher is, uh, I get a ton of music sent to me by all sorts of publishers, big and small. So, publishers definitely play a role in pitching music. I also go to some publishers if I have a really specific creative brief, and they can, pitch the artists that they represent. Publishers also help with if your song does get licensed, they can help with uh, getting the back end royalties together. So they're important to a songwriter in that sense as well. But that said, if you don't have a publisher, that doesn't mean that you can't get syncs. There are plenty of third party representation companies. Some of the ones I like are Terrorbird, Low Profile, and what else is out there? Greater Goods. Those are three good ones. And they represent music that doesn't necessarily have a publisher or a label associated with it. So I would recommend for independent artists to research those third-party reps and see if they can reach out to them and which ones might be a good fit for their music.
Okay, and they end up kind of playing a similar role as a publisher, or what do they do specifically that?
So the third-party reps represent music just for sync. So they work with music supervisors, sending out playlists of their new music. They help artists who might not have the ability to or the experience with, getting approvals for licenses, and they can help kind of guide these artists through that process. And just like a publisher, I would reach out to a third-party rep and give them a very specific brief if I have one, and they can pitch music that might specifically fit what I'm looking for.
Okay, so they're kind of like another reputable source for you guys.
Exactly.
So instead of just having 1,000 emails saying like, hey, like I looked you up on IMDb and I think you would like my music, it's kind of another place that kind of curates things. Okay, these people have these things in order, and I can kind of trust them.
Exactly.
Okay, what are other kind of more legal or like what can immediately just kill a sync deal?
Well, if you don't know who the writers are on the track, if you don't have writer splits and publisher splits worked out already, or if you don't know who owns the master recording, that's a red flag. It's pretty hard to move forward without that information. And just knowing the difference between the publishing and the master and the writer shares. Artists should be focused on making art. And of course, I would encourage artists to learn as much as possible about sync and publishing. But I think that having a third party, whether that's a publisher or just a sync rep, can help the artist focus on their art rather than the annoying business stuff.
Okay, well, that kind of leads into my next question too. Is how can an independent artist maybe start building relationships with music supervisors, or stick to these third parties, or do you think there's any kind of merit in trying to build some of these relationships on your own?
I would say that it can't hurt to learn a lot about sync and reach out to music supervisors that you like, but keep in mind that it's very hard to get your music to these people. We get a lot of unsolicited emails of people sending music. We don't know where it's coming from. We don't know, who owns this music. It's much, much easier to go through somebody who is, their day job is working in sync, somebody whose day job is curating relationships with music supervisors. That's the most surefire way to do it.
Makes a lot of sense. And let's say somebody is just really gung ho about trying to keep everything completely on their own. They don't want to give up, the admin fee or anything like that. What's maybe a way that they can kind of cut through so when they are sending an email that it doesn't just like take the shotgun approach and maybe has at least a chance of maybe getting some feedback?
There are a couple things that you can say in an email that signal to a music supervisor that you have a somewhat of a basis of knowledge about sync and clearances. So if you can say in an email, we own 100% of the master and 100% of the publishing, that both shows that we can easily clear the song through one person, and also shows that this person knows what they're doing. They're not just throwing music at me. And in terms of knowing if their music is ready, that is a really tough question. There are a lot of companies that do writers' camps. I don't know how exactly artists get connected with those, but those can often help. Sometimes there are music supervisors who attend those, and you can talk one on one with a music supervisor who can give specific feedback. But also keep in mind that all music supervisors are different. We all have different tastes. We like different kinds of music. So if you get a certain type of feedback from one person, it's not necessarily, true 100% of the time. I think authenticity is really important. And people can tell if artists are writing songs specifically for sync. And sometimes that's good. I think a lot of ads and trailers really like sync songs. But I think for a lot of the things that I work on, we want really authentic sounding music that has a voice that is unique to that artist.
Right. What is maybe something that you've worked on recently or in the past that you're really proud of, or that really stood out to you in one of your projects?
I'm working on the show Good Girls right now. We're about to start season 4. And when I first started on this show, I wasn't really sure what it was going to be. The premise is sort of like a Breaking Bad type thing, but with 3 women. And, at first we were using sort of like Selena Gomez and a lot of pop stuff like that. But as the show has gone on, we've gotten weirder and weirder and more experimental with the music. And I think we've developed a sound that doesn't sound like any other show. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done. It's also one of those shows where the producers are willing to take risks with the music and put a lot of trust in the music supervisors. I supervise this with my coworker, John Leahy. And that's not always the case on shows. Not that that's a bad thing. Some shows, don't require music to set tones or tell stories. There's plenty of shows that I've worked on that barely use music, or they want very broad, very popular music. But I think Good Girls it's certainly the most fun I've had recently. I also worked on the new High Fidelity reboot. That show is really fun because it's so much about music. But one drawback with that show creatively is that there are so many writers and producers and editors, and everybody has a say on the music. So I think a couple times we ended up going with just the common denominator of what everybody liked, which, didn't necessarily make everybody happy, but that was certainly fun to work on from a music standpoint.
It sounds really exciting, be able to kind of bring your taste and to find some of this more obscure music and then see that, do you watch these shows too afterwards, or do you get cuts before? Like, I'd just be, curious to see kind of hanging out with like some friends or something and, put on an episode and then kind of just, I would just sit and like watch them and just see how they kind of react, or like if their ears perk up, or do you ever do that?
Yeah, I mean, I get cuts very early. I mean, I'm working with these episodes from the script phase just to see if there's any music in the script that needs to be cleared before they shoot, or, if people are dancing and we need to coordinate that ahead of time. But depending on the show, I would say most of the shows that I work on, I do enjoy watching. And, I like watching them with my husband and seeing how he reacts. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm more likely to watch a show that I've worked on than a film, just because films are a much longer, more drawn out process. They can take many, many months, whereas I'm generally only working on an episode of TV for a couple weeks at the most.
Per episode?
Yeah, per episode.
Is there maybe some artists that you've kind of found that kind of fit into a show, and then you find yourself kind of going back and finding like, oh, like I wonder what else or what other music they have, or almost trying to like sneak them in to try and put them on, or very much always like, I need to create this feeling, I need to create this sort of atmosphere for this scene?
Um, that's a good question. There are definitely artists that have been used multiple times on a couple of my shows. For example, in Good Girls, we've used a French artist called Juniore a couple times, and an artist that I really like called Mathilde. We've used, I think, 2 or 3 of her songs. Um, but as I would say, as a show goes on, it develops a sound, and it's fun to listen to music and immediately hear something and say, "Oh wow, that would be good for this show." For example, I worked on the show New Girl with Zoe Deschanel from seasons 2 through 7, whatever the last season was, and that was a show that really developed a sound for itself in a way where I could hear a song and say, "Oh, I know this would be a great New Girl end credits song, or great for a montage," or something like that.
How often does kind of lyrical ideas or things like that play into it? Is that part of it too, or are you listening more to just the overall kind of vibe and feeling of a song, or are you trying to really sit in there? I know like Breaking Bad sometimes lyrically it seems to work completely in line with what's happening on the show, and I wonder how much is like a lucky coincidence and then people kind of go back and dissect that, or how much of that was actually a creative idea or kind of just happened naturally.
That's also a good question.
Or both, I'm sure it happens too.
Both certainly happens. It's really exciting when you find a song and you're like, wow, I cannot believe how perfectly the lyrics fit. Um, One example of this is I worked on the show Goliath with Billy Bob Thornton on Amazon. And when we were looking for some main title music, and they were showing us some just imagery, like still photos of some ideas they have for what it might look like, and a description of, Billy Bob Thornton walks into the ocean. He walks past like ashes on fire and they blow past him. And I happened to find a song that was like lyrically really spot on, and that was almost immediately chosen as the main title song for that season. But there's also sometimes audiences like to fill in the gaps. They don't necessarily like to be hit over the head with an idea. Um, and it's also partially up to, showrunners and producers. Some really like when the lyrics fit and some don't. Or, for example, on Good Girls, we don't really use any like songs about money. It just, I guess it feels a little too obvious to the showrunners and the producers, because it's about, women laundering money and making counterfeit bills and stuff. It can really go both ways, and we just take it case by case. I do collect and sort music by lyrical content and lyrical themes on occasion, just in case those come in handy, but it's certainly not the only thing that goes into a creative decision.
Yeah, I've heard a lot even like about storytelling. Like you mentioned, like don't like kind of beat people over the head. They kind of want to figure it out, right? Like don't get like give them 2 + 2.
Exactly.
Don't give them 4, right? And let them just kind of fill in the gaps.
Exactly.
So you have like a running catalog, or like do you have like a crazy list? So I know like Rivers Cuomo, right, from Weezer, he has this giant document of lyrics that he can just like type in and search different words, and they're like arranged by syllables and rhymes and all these. Like do you have something organized like that, but like with music for like feelings and tones and things like that, or do you kind of just have like a running list in your head, or maybe you just hear something or
I organize most of my music in Spotify. I have hundreds of playlists. Um, some are by decade, some are by genre, some are by feel, some are by lyrical content, and you know, it's got nothing on Rivers Cuomo's giant document of lyrics, but I do reference those a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's just an ongoing process to every time I hear music, new or old, I'm constantly cataloging stuff and adding it to various playlists.
where are some of your favorite places right now to find new music?
I love Hype Machine. I think they do a really good job curating really interesting music. They also have a newsletter where they will reach out to a musician that they've written about and have them pick a couple songs that they like. Um, I'm such a sucker for Spotify Discover Weekly. I know that's a little controversial, but the algorithm just really works for me, I guess. Um, I've gotten people to do guest mixes for the radio show that I do now on Resonance Extra. The show is called The Lonesome Crowd, and I love the songs that people bring to their guest mixes. Um, yeah, I mean, I really do love getting recommendations from friends. That's always been a tried and true way ever since I was a kid to get really cool music recommendations.
Yeah, I know you have a really, really eclectic taste too to begin with. Um, so that must have played a huge role in kind of now your job on a day to day is to try and find some things that are more obscure or
Definitely.
unheard of. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one reason that I really was interested in music licensing to begin with was when I was in high school and college, things were starting to change with, bands aren't making as much money from touring or record sales. A lot of bands feel like when they're starting out, they have to give their music away for free. And music just has unfortunately been devalued in the last decade or so. And with licensing, it's a way to find a more obscure artist, give them a little bit of exposure and a paycheck that's hopefully somewhat significant. Or, it's at least a way to say, we hear you, we like what you're doing, we want to support it.
And kind of touching on that, what is a typical thing that an artist can look out for from a sync placement on the royalty end, and then also just the upfront sync fee? What can people expect? What's the range?
It varies very widely. It depends on the type of use. I mean, a song that plays in the background of a bar scene for a couple seconds is going to get way less money than a song that plays over the end credits of an episode or a montage. Um, and a song with vocals might get more on the royalties end than an instrumental. The type of use, uh, a background use versus a end credits use also plays a role in royalties. I actually don't know what royalties look like and how much people generally get from those, but it varies not only based on the type of use, but the network. I think if you get a song in a show that's on Fox or ABC, that would pay more on the royalty side than a more limited network like HBO.
Right. And I think also even just what region and like where it's played. I know, right? That's a lot of the performing rights organizations are kind of out there
Yes,
collecting on your behalf, stuff like this. And
very true.
yeah, I know it's even like that with like streaming on Spotify. People are like, oh, like how much do you get per stream? It's like, well, where did they listen? You know, are they where? What was the ad in front of it? What's the genre? Right? There's all these different kind of things that go into how they calculate everything behind the scenes. And then I think you just have to cross your fingers and hope you're getting all your money.
Definitely. And I mean, hopefully, trust that the music supervisor is working on behalf of, even though the music supervisor is hired by the showrunner or, by the network. In my opinion, we're working for the artist. There's no benefit to the music supervisor to give a band a fee that's lower than they can offer realistically. Like it saving saving money by paying a band less doesn't put any extra money in the music supervisor's pocket. So, you know, in the interest of maintaining good relationships with licensors and supporting artists, hopefully, nobody's getting stiffed in terms of fees.
And then, so like when a show comes to you, do they have like a specific budget for maybe the entire episode, the series? And then you're kind of working on your end to figure out like, okay, obviously something more mainstream. I know that for Mad Men, right, the two Beatles songs, I think I heard rumors that they cost like $250,000 for those syncs.
Ooh, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it was crazy, crazy. But how much of your job is kind of playing into that and saying like, okay, here's my budget for this episode. I need these types of songs, and then you're kind of figuring out like how much you have for each sync, or they're just saying like, hey, we need this one song, we have this much for it.
Uh, so for television, I really prefer working on TV shows as opposed to films. And one reason is that we do have an episodic budget, but most networks will allow you to, if you have a budget per episode of $40,000 and one episode you spend $60,000, you can make it up later on with an episode that only, spends $20,000. So that gives you a lot more flexibility. Whereas with a film, it's like, here's the budget, make it all work. Um, so working with the budget is certainly part of the job, but if a if the showrunner really wants a song, you know, I don't feel like my job is to go to a licensor and say, "Hey, I know this song, you want this, X amount of money for it, but here's all we have and like let's make it work." If the artist wants to do that, I think they should do it. But people have to put a value on their music, and I don't think people should have to devalue their music to fit a certain budget unless that's what they want to do. Um, but there have definitely been times when we've run out of money. The producer is insisting on a song that we can't afford, and they'll go to their boss and request extra money, and they'll either say yes or no. Um, it's a little bit of a political aspect of the job. You're just trying to keep the music supervisor really wants to keep everybody happy, and it's a delicate balance.
A lot of the time, I mean, then really, then which is the huge advantage of having a publisher is then you can reach out to them and they're already setting the price. So I'm saying, hey, we have this song that we would love for our show, and then the publisher comes back to you and say, cool, this is our fee for that song, or you guys saying like, hey, this is what we have for this. Does it work for you guys or not?
It works both ways. So there are times when um, I, we've run out of money, but we really need a certain type of song. We can go to publishers or labels and say, hey, we only have $5,000. Do you have any, very indie bands that haven't gotten a sync, bands that, could really use a little extra cash right now who would be willing to do a $5,000 sync? Um, then there's also, when we want a specific song and we send them a request for a quote, then they give us the best price that they can. Usually we say, can you please, clear it for this amount? But it's a big discussion on their end. Um, they also have one thing that's great about publishers and licensing reps and labels is that they have precedents set of we don't license this type of use or this band for less than a certain amount of money. And they do that negotiating on behalf of the band.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's becoming more and more clear because, in the whole indie sort of mentality, as much as we like to push it, and we've heard about the Chance the Rappers and these kind of things, and hold on to your publishing is as long as possible. At least definitely for me in this conversation, it's becoming more and more clear just how vital having people going to bat for you on this front really is. Very much like an agent or something like that.
Yeah, and an agent or a manager or, anybody who works on behalf of the band, a lawyer, they could all be doing this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a publisher or a label. But just to have somebody advocating for you who has experience and knows what types of quotes are reasonable versus unreasonable, that's really helpful.
Is there ever a time where you maybe hear a song that you really love that you think will fit, but you don't want either the vocals on there or even just the main melody, and you would ask somebody like, hey, can we get a copy of this as just instrumental? Or even just on the other side, as an artist giving myself the best chance to get a placement, does it make sense for me to kind of make multiple versions where I have one without the lead or without the lead melody, or I play it on another instrument or something like that?
Absolutely. I think that at least having a vocal version and an instrumental version and a clean version if the vocal version is not clean, that's a very minimum. I've definitely reached out to artists for stems if we're trying to cut a song into a scene where there's a lot of dialogue. Um, or if there's, a certain sound effect in a song that doesn't quite sound right. I think that having all of that stuff available is a huge asset.
So you'll ask for like full on stems sometimes,
Yes.
and then you can pick and choose what elements and make your own kind of almost of a remix.
Yes. And
Oh wow.
I mean, some people don't want their music manipulated like that, which of course is totally fine. But if you can make that stuff available, it certainly is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's it seems especially in today's day and age, it's pretty easy to do that. And then I'm sure you guys can
Yeah,
communicate like within limitations, right? Like, oh, I don't want like a vocal only sort of thing, or you can kind of set a precedent for what sounds like every part of this is entirely negotiable all the time.
yeah, there are a lot of moving pieces, I would say.
What are maybe just some three common things that you see that you find yourself like continually placing, whether it's a genre or maybe any common denominators?
One thing that I'm always looking for that's kind of hard to find is songs that are like sad but hopeful. I sometimes describe it as wistful. I guess maybe like platonic love songs, like, family or friend love as opposed to romantic love. Those can sometimes be tough to find, or there's a sort of a limited number of those. And um, for some of the shows I'm working on right now, I wouldn't say this is a universal need, but songs that have like a big continuous build or start quiet and get really big or have contrasting sections, those can be very helpful and are very hard to they're hard to think of just off the top of your head. So I've started building a playlist in Spotify of songs that I come across with contrasting sections and stuff. I mean, think of like the very obvious example is Layla by Eric Clapton. Like, the front end and back end are different but related, and it's all one song. Um, yeah, those are hard to find and come in handy quite a bit.
Okay, yeah, so definitely something to keep in mind. Yeah, I definitely don't pander, but I think these are things that can can be helpful when trying to sit down and write some songs. I know it's I just watched the episode. Have you ever seen Songland? Have you ever seen that show?
I haven't.
So it's the show on NBC, and they have like Ryan Tedder, um, Esther Dean. You know, like Ryan Tedder from One Republic. Esther Dean is written for Rihanna, and then they have different artists come on. John Legend was on there, and Will I Am, and then they have like 3 or 4 songwriters come and like perform the song, and then they choose a couple. It's kind of like an American Idol for songwriters,
Oh, okay.
sort of situation. It's actually really cool. The show on itself is like a tiny bit gimmicky, but like seeing these huge writers and producers like working, like reworking these songs like in the studio and like live kind of in front of you is it's absolutely incredible. I think for just anybody to kind of see the process. But I bring it up because they actually just did the episode that just aired was with BB Rexa, and she's looking for a song for the Olympics. And what ended up kind of happening is there was a songwriter who came in, and she had a song like called Gold, like I'm going for the gold. And they're like, yeah, like we like a lot of this, but it's a little bit just too on the head.
Too literal. Yeah.
Yeah, just like a little too obvious. And so I feel like that's maybe a little bit of your point before where it's like, oh, if when you're talking about like money heist or whatever, and you're like, oh, put the money in the bag, it's just like, okay,
Exactly.
like we get it.
Yeah.
But that's definitely something I would check. I mean, I think the show's like fantastic, and they've had some pretty big songs
Yeah. I
come
mean,
out of it, I
I
guess,
like
too.
all the artists you mentioned, so I'm interested in checking that out.
Well, I think that pretty much sums it up for me. Very informative in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I appreciate your time. I appreciate your contribution. And I think it's also, just kind of as a side note, it's super clear just how much you love music. And I think that if that's kind of what's happening within that world is it's just a lot of people who really genuinely love to find new music and finding the right moments that it can really like elevate a scene it's really inspiring and really hopeful for me to be perfectly honest, because I think we just hear so much about the numbers and so much as how many streams do you have and things like that on like the label side and kind of trying to build your team, like how much are you how fast is your train already moving, that this is kind of an area in the industry that is still just really really about making the best decision musically for the scene and just ultimately just people that care and love music.
Yeah. I mean, I like to think so. And personally, I like to keep it as passion forward as possible. There's, of course, a business aspect to it, but the real joy for me is in the creative parts.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking with you again sometime.
Thanks so much for having me.